and welcome everyone to this episode of WebSphere Community Spotlight. My name is Trevor Crawford. My colleague and co-presenter is Eric Lau. We are both developers on the Open Liberty Developer Experience team, and today we'll be talking about fast iterative development of cloud-native apps with Liberty's dev mode. Just a quick note, please feel free to post any questions you may have in the chat. We will attempt to address them during the presentation. All right, let's get started. So what is fast iterative development and why does it matter? When it comes to building cloud-native Java applications, fast iterative development on application code is key to the productivity of developers. However, Java application development can be quite cumbersome. When a code change is made that a developer wants to test out, they typically have to rebuild, repackage, and redeploy their application just to see if their changes worked or not. This process is what we call the inner loop. This inner loop is repeated numerous times throughout the development process, as developers prefer to make small, iterative changes and verify those changes as they go. Each time developers have to package a jar or a war to deploy their application, developer productivity is lost. The ability to quickly implement, test, and try out code changes without the baggage of having to rebuild, repackage, and redeploy their application allows developers to focus just on their code. So essentially, to achieve fast iterative development, we want developers to be able to avoid the 3 R's. The faster a developer can iterate through the coding and testing process or run through that inner loop, the quicker they can be sure that their code is working the way it should be. That's what matters to developers, the code. So if you're a developer building cloud-native applications for IBM's lightweight server runtime Open Liberty, or for WebSphere Liberty, which is built on top of Open Liberty, you may be wondering, how can I achieve fast iterative development? What tools does Liberty offer to help me focus solely on my code? Liberty's solution to address developer needs and provide a fast and efficient inner loop is Liberty Dev Mode. With Dev Mode, we aim to ensure that developers don't need to worry about anything else other than their code and whether or not their application is working the way they expect it to. It is intended to simplify and streamline the inner loop of the development process. Dev Mode is a feature of the build plugins for Liberty, which are the Liberty Maven plugin and Liberty Gradle plugin. Both Maven and Gradle are open source build automation and project management tools that can be used to simplify the build process for Java projects as well as other kinds of projects. Maven relies on a central file called the POM file to manage the project, and Gradle relies on build.gradle. These will be shown later in a demo, along with how to set up the Liberty build plugin for each. Dev Mode runs on the command line using one of the commands shown here, either Maven Liberty Dev or Gradle Liberty Dev. Because it is a command line based utility, Dev Mode works in conjunction with any IDE. However, if command line isn't your thing, it can also be run through Ide Extensions currently available as previews for VS Code and IntelliJ. Those will be covered in a demo as well. So how does Dev Mode help developers achieve that fast inner loop experience? Dev Mode compiles code changes, processes configuration changes, and updates the Liberty runtime for developers through hot deployment. This means developers do not need to rebuild, repackage, or redeploy their application to see their changes in action, and they can immediately see the effects their changes have. Dev Mode also allows developers to run tests either manually or automatically after code changes. By default, Dev Mode starts the Liberty server in debug mode, which allows developers to attach a debugger using their favorite IDE if they need to dig deeper into the application code behavior. Overall, Dev Mode simplifies and enhances the developer experience with Liberty, allowing for fast iterative development. Developers can just focus on the code. I'm now going to pass it over to Eric, who will take you through a demo of Liberty Dev Mode.
Thanks, Trevor. So I'll be showing a demo of Liberty Dev Mode. So to get started, well, first let's take a look at a sample project. So from the Open Liberty website, openliberty.io, if you go to the guides section, you will find a number of sample projects, and each of these guides have a different sample project as well as some steps on how to build up the sample into a working application according to each scenario. So let's take a look at this Restful web service guide. So in this scenario, what we will be doing is creating a RESTful web service. In other words, a simple REST service where all we're doing is returning the system properties of the JVM that you're running on. And this will be returned as a JSON representation. So each property is a JSON object like the following. So if your OS was Mac and you have Java version 1.8, you would see these kind of properties in the results, as well as some other properties. And this will be using the HTTP API by using the JAX-RS API to provide this RESTful web service. So let's take a look at the code. So here I have my project using this sample project. And what we have here is a very simple setup. So we have your Java class, which is currently empty. You have your Liberty configuration, which is the server XML file that configures your Liberty server. So right now, this is just a basic starting point. And you have your POM file. And your POM file, so right now we're using Maven, but I will show a Gradle in a moment. So your POM file is the build file for your Java project. So here you have your properties, your project properties. You have some dependencies for the different APIs you want to use, and most importantly for dev mode, we have this. You have the Liberty Maven plugin. So by defining this Liberty Maven plugin in your POM file, then you can use this plugin to interact with Liberty and also to make use of dev mode. So by default, if you provide the plugin like this, then this will install the latest version of Open Liberty. But if you were using a Webster Liberty, what you could do is you can define Webster Liberty in your project, and you can do that by, for example, taking a look at the Liberty Maven plugin documentation, finding the section for the Maven artifacts, and you find the different Maven artifacts here that you can use for the different Liberty runtimes. So you have the different Open Liberty runtimes and the different Webster Liberty runtimes. So for example, let's say you want to use the Webster Liberty kernel, and the kernel is the smallest runtime package of Liberty that contains no runtime features, but those runtime features will be installed automatically, dynamically as you add them in your server XML. So let's copy this example here, and let's put it in our plugin. So if you configure the plugin like this, let's change this to WLP kernel and change this to the latest version. Then by doing this, this will install Webster Liberty for you. But for now, let's just remove that and let's use Open Liberty. So once we actually start dev mode, we can do that by going to the command line and running Maven Liberty dev. And this actually starts dev mode for you. So you'll see what it's actually doing. It's compiling your project, building your project, deploying Liberty, and then starting up Liberty in development mode. So let's give that a moment, and then you'll see that once dev mode is actually started, then you will see a startup message telling you that Liberty is running in dev mode. Right, so here you see the startup message along with some different commands that you can actually run in dev mode, but we'll get to that in a bit. And also you see some useful information about your server, such as what port the server is listening on, and also the debug port that you can connect the debugger to, which we'll also show in a moment. So now dev mode is started. Now we can actually get to making some changes in our code. So let's go back to the guide, and then let's copy the code for your application. So you have your application path here that you can put in your code. So the system application class, let's replace it with this. So all this does is it defines the application path for your REST application using the JAX-RS APIs. And now let's define a path within this application path. So let's copy the next part of the code, which is the properties resource. So here you notice I'm adding these Java files in my code, or modifying the Java files. And then I save that. So once I save that, let's take a look at the dev mode output. We can see that dev mode is actually recompiling your code as you make changes, and then automatically redeploying your application and updating it so that it will pick up the changes. But in order to actually make use of this code, we need to add a feature in our server XML. So in our server XML, which I mentioned before, let's copy this code. So once we put that in the server XML, what you see here is now we're defining this feature for JAX-RS so that the JAX-RS APIs can be made use of. And importantly, for Liberty, what you would need is you would need an HTTP endpoint so that you can define what ports to listen on for HTTP and HTTPS, as well as your web application. So if you're using since this project is using a packaging type, you have your WAR file here defined here, and the context route that you want the application to listen on. And these are, I'm using variable substitution. So these variables actually come from your POM file. So if you look at the POM, the project properties, you can see the liberty.var properties, and these provide the different variables that you can use in your server XML. And these and the Liberty Maven plugin will actually make use of these variables and help you do the variable substitution. Right, so now let's actually hit the endpoints and see what happens. So you see that now the endpoint works. I didn't have to restart the server or anything like that. Everything was picked up automatically. And you can see that, for example, my OS is using Mac, which is what I'm using. So that's working properly. So that's how you would make changes and test out your code manually. But for example, let's say you wanted to do some automated tests. So let's say you wanted to run some unit tests or integration tests. How would you do that? Well, dev mode provides some functionality to help you with running tests. So all you do is you can press enter at any time in the console, and this will run your unit tests and integration tests. And here I don't have any tests configured, so nothing actually happened. So now let's actually add a test. So I'll copy this code for my test case and put it in my project. And when I save that, then you can see that dev mode recompiled the test, and I can press enter to actually run the test, and you'll see that it passed. Now, let's say you actually wanted to run your test automatically instead of by pressing enter. So you can quit dev mode and let's say restart dev mode using the hot test parameter. By running with the hot test parameter, this will actually run the test automatically and after every change to your application so that you get immediate feedback on your changes and to see whether they actually worked or not. So you'll see once dev mode starts up here, then it will run the tests right after it starts up. Right, so you see the test is being run here. And now for example, let's try changing our code. So we'll change the URL for the path. Now we'll see that the test is run automatically, and then we expect the test to fail, and it does. So of course, if we revert that, then the test will now pass. Right, so that's testing. And the third major feature for dev mode is to be able to attach a debugger at any time. So you can see that when dev mode started up, you can see the debug port, which is the default port of 7777. So Liberty is listening on this for the debugger to be attached. So in your IDE, let's say you want to attach a debugger, what you can do is set a breakpoint and then attach a debugger. So to make this more interesting, let's change the code here to make this code a little bit more complex. So let's say I want to inject something into my properties. And then put all the properties there instead. And now let's add a breakpoint and then configure it for debugger. So in VS Code, let's say we want to configure our debugger. Let's get rid of the default configuration and add a Java debug configuration. So let's attach to the local host using port 7777. We'll save that and then actually run the debugger. So you see right away that debugger is attached. And let's actually refresh our endpoints. And you see that right away the execution gets paused at your breakpoint. And now you can step through your code and see the variables and so on as you would with the debugger. Right. So those are the main functionality of dev mode, and that's using Maven. Now, for example, what if you are using Gradle instead? Well, with Gradle, you can, well, this is how you would set up your Gradle project. So in Gradle, you have your build.gradle, which is similar to the Maven build file, but using Gradle instead. And what you would have is you apply the Liberty plugin, you define where to get the Liberty plugin, for example, from Maven Central. So you have the Liberty Gradle plugin defined here. And then the rest of your build file, such as your project properties and your dependencies and so on. And then you can actually start dev mode through Gradle using Gradle Liberty dev. And by doing this, this will start dev mode using Gradle rather than Maven. So we'll just give a moment for that to start up. And then of course this will build your project using Gradle and start dev mode. Right. So then here you see dev mode has been started, and then you can do the same thing as what I showed earlier for Maven, but using Gradle. And of course, everything will get recompiled as you make changes and so on. And then to quit dev mode, you can just type Q and press enter, or just press Control C. So you're using Q and enter to quit. Right, so that's dev mode using the command line through either Maven or Gradle. But we also have some Ide extensions. We have some previews for Ide extensions currently for VS Code and for IntelliJ. So if you go to the VS Code marketplace, you will find the Open Liberty Tools extension there. Or for IntelliJ, you can go to the JetBrains marketplace and find the Open Liberty Tools extension there. So once you install either of those extensions in your editor, and for example, in VS Code, if you go to you'll find the Liberty Dev dashboard provided by the extension. And then as long as you have your Liberty Maven plugin defined in your POM file, then the extension will find your project. And then you can interact with Liberty through dev mode using this menu here. So you right click and then you can choose start. So this will start dev mode or start it in a container, which will show in the later section of this presentation, or other things to interact with dev mode. And interestingly, you can also view the integration test report. So we can view the test report that we saw for the test that we ran earlier, and then you can see the results here. Right. So that's using IDEs. And similarly for IntelliJ, in IntelliJ you have this Liberty Dev dashboard, and the same thing, you can interact with Liberty through that. Now, if you wanted to find more information about dev mode, you can always go to the Open Liberty website, go to the documentation section, so the docs section, and then find dev mode there. And this will have all the information that you need to get started using dev mode, and how to configure your project and so on. And if you want to find more information, more detailed information on the actual dev mode for Maven or Gradle, you can find the documentation here. So you have the dev goal for Maven, and you have the detailed information such as different ways you can start dev mode for different scenarios with different parameters, or the number of optional parameters that you can provide, and the same for Gradle. Right, so that's all for this portion of the presentation. And before we move on to the next section about containers, are there any questions at this point?
I think there was one that came in the chat, but you answered it during the demo. So yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so yeah, feel free to continue posting questions in the chat as we go. All right, thanks, Eric.
Okay, back to you, Trevor.
Yeah, thanks. So we're gonna move on to, I guess, the next section of the presentation. So the next part of the episode is going to focus on containers. So for most developers working on cloud native applications, they will be building applications to run on containers. Dev mode can run with container support, and we refer to this functionality as DevC. DevC provides all the same productivity boosting features as dev mode, such as hot deployment, hot testing, and easy debugging, but now your application is running on Liberty inside of a Docker container. The command to run devc is the same as dev mode, just use devc instead of dev. Developing with containers helps to minimize the differences between development and production environments, meaning developers can be more confident that an application that works during development will also work in production with no surprise code or configuration issues. So if developers are writing applications for containers, why use devc? The iterative process, or the inner loop we've talked about, is even more slow and tedious when working with containers. Every time source code or configuration is updated, on top of repackaging, developers need to rebuild their Docker image and start up a new container. It's a lot of effort just to test out small changes. However, with devc, all you need to do is set up your Maven or Gradle project as usual, with only the addition of a Docker file. devc will handle starting up the application inside a Liberty container and will handle all the tedious extra steps required while developing with containers. Code and configuration changes are hot deployed straight to the application on the container, and the effects can be seen right away as with regular dev mode. Developers can still easily run tests against the application on the container, and using the debugger works the exact same as regular dev mode. So now you're able to achieve your fast iterative development while working with containers. So once again, I'm going to hand it over to Eric, this time for a demo of Liberty Dev Mode for containers.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. Right, so I'll be showing a demo of dev mode with containers. So in order to get started, the first thing you will need is a Docker file. So in your project, I have an example Docker file here. So what you would need is basically you need to specify the parent image that you want to use. And OpenLibrary provides a number of different parent images that you can use. For example, this one is using the OpenLibrary kernel, using Java 8 with OpenJ9, and using the universal base image. But there are other images that you can find on Docker Hub. So once you have that, then you also need to specify the configuration files. So you would specify to copy your Liberty server XML into your container, as well as any other configuration files that you may need. For example, the Liberty plugin makes use of a variable substitution file, so that you would need to copy that if you want to use variable substitution, as I shown earlier. And finally, you would need to copy the war file for your application into the container. So once you have the Docker file, then the rest is pretty much the same as dev mode. So as long as your POM has your Liberty Maven plugin, then you can start dev mode. But in this case, you will start it with Liberty dev C and C for container. So in this case, it will actually start Liberty in the container rather than in the local environments. And what you see here, let me expand this. What you see here is actually dev mode is actually building the Docker image for you. So it actually makes a temporary copy of your Docker file and makes some changes in the Docker file to allow for this iterative development that we're interested in. And then it builds your Docker image. So you can see the results of the Docker build happening there. And then dev mode actually does a Docker run command to start your container. But it does a number of other things, such as it maps certain default ports, and also it mounts a number of different folders so that you get this sort of iterative developments that you expect. And then you don't actually have to rebuild or restart your container. And then once you see the dev mode startup message, you actually see some useful information about your container. For example, your container internal ports is being mapped to your certain local ports that you can access from your local host. as well as some Docker network information that you may be interested in if you're using Docker networking. And then once dev mode is started, you can actually access your endpoint here. Again, using localhost because this port is mapped. And then here you actually see that the OS name is Linux rather than Mac because the container is using Linux. And then, of course, we can change your Java code, and you will see that the code gets recompiled, and the container picks up the Liberty in the container picks up the change right away. And then you can access the new URL based on my change. And then that works. Right. So yeah, right. So that's dev mode with containers. And so that's using a Java file. But if you actually wanted to, for example, change your Docker file, let's say you wanted to use a different parent image or something like that, then in this case, for example, instead of Java 8, you want to use Java 11. When you save this, you see that in this case, dev mode actually has to rebuild the image because you changed your Docker file. So dev mode actually picks that up for you automatically, and it does an automatic rebuild and restart of your container, so you don't have to do anything manually. And then you will see once that starts up, then dev mode is then everything's updated, and then it's using your latest Docker file. Right, so that started up. And then let's quit that. Now, for example, there are some other, if you're working with containers, there are some other parameters that you may be interested in. And again, you would find this on the in the dev mode documentation under Maven or Gradle. And for example, you could use if you wanted to use a different Docker file, you can use the Docker file parameter. So liberty dev c and then -d Docker file, and then you can give it a different path or a different file name for your Docker file. The default is just Docker file, but if you wanted to use a different file name, so Docker file Ubuntu, for example, and then I have a Docker file Ubuntu, which actually uses the Ubuntu as a parent image rather than the UBI, for example. Or you can have a different path for your Docker file and so on. So that's using a custom Docker file or the custom Docker file path. For example, other things, and something else that might be useful is that normally when you're running when you're running Docker, you're using Docker run, you may want to bind certain ports or bind certain directories. And with dev mode, you can do that by providing a docker run ops command. So the docker run ops. So this provides additional options to the docker run command that dev mode issues. For example, let's say I want to mount an additional directory. So -v my dir to my container dir. If I run it this way, then dev mode will actually append this to this docker run command and mount that for you during its container startup. Right. So that's all for the demo. I guess back to you, Trevor, to wrap up.
Great, thanks, Eric. Yeah, so I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I guess we're gonna, go to the last slide here and wrap up. So hopefully now it's clear how dev mode and dev mode for containers can help boost developer productivity with a fast inner loop experience. If you are interested, please give dev mode a try. There are sample projects on GitHub for regular dev mode and dev c, both with links at the top of this slide. Open Liberty, along with the Liberty Maven plugin, Liberty Gradle plugin, and dev mode are all open source projects. We welcome any feedback or contributions for these projects, so feel free to open issues or pull requests. The links in the middle section of the slide are for Liberty Maven and for the Liberty Gradle plugins. Below that is a link to the main page for the dev mode documentation. You'll find all the information you need there on how to get started with dev mode and dev c, as well as links to the marketplace to download the Open Liberty tools for VS Code and IntelliJ. We're also available on Gitter, so feel free to reach out and chat with us there about developer experience for Liberty. For more general information about Open Liberty, you can always check out openliberty.io. So thank you very much for watching today's session. We hope it was useful for you, and we hope you will be able to use Liberty Dev Mode to help boost your development productivity. Once again, please reach out to us for any further discussion, questions, or issues. We're always happy to help. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.